Thank you all for joining us, wherever you are in the world. This webinar has been broadcast as part of GIZ's E4D Employment and Skills for Development in Africa programme, of which our Professional Driver Training Uganda project is part. It partners GIZ, Transaid and Safeway Rightway. Today we've got 3 speakers planned. There will be myself. I'm Transaid's Road Safety Project Manager. We'll then be hearing from Susan Tumuhaire from Safeway Rightway. She's Safeway Rightway's Project Coordinator. And then we'll be hearing from Jason Finch, Transaid Project Manager. So welcome everyone. So this webinar is being recorded, and everyone attending or who's registered for this webinar will receive a link to the recording and the slide deck, which are then free to share. We'll be having a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, but this webinar will not have an audio function for attendees to ask questions. Alternatively, questions can be posted via the question function. Now, different devices and systems have different layouts for this webinar, but somewhere there should be possibly a speech bubble with a question mark in it, or possibly question with a question mark where you can click on and then type in your questions. If you're not finding that, alternatively, you can post your questions in the chat function. And the questions can be sent anytime throughout this whole webinar. You don't need to wait till the question and answer session starts. As you come up with a question, please do add that, and then we will try and address as many of these questions as we can at the end of the presentations. So the low number of women working as professional drivers has been attributed to gender bias stereotypes which straddle the intersection between work and society. Deeply embedded in some cultures, including male-dominated professions, gender bias has historically reaffirmed barriers for women wanting to enter into certain sections, as well as aiding the creation of discriminating work environments and poor working conditions. Until better processes, including gender awareness and safeguarding efforts, are fully introduced, it's likely that the transport sector will continue to fail to attract and retain a more diverse workforce. Examples of good practice do exist in sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps most notably in inter- and intra-city passenger transport, as well as in some cargo and freight industries. So this webinar will highlight the results of one Ugandan company that does actively seek to employ female drivers. Next slide, please. So I'm going to briefly talk about Transaid's Professional Driver Training Programme. This programme looks to enhance the capacity in country, in sub-Saharan African countries, to deliver professional driver training. So we build the capacity of training institutions. This capacity building can include the donation of vehicles suitable for training, as you'll see in the background of this photograph here. Some of these were donated by Transaid, but our key focus is building the capacity of trainers in country. So we train the trainer, who then trains the driver. And then to make this sustainable, we train master trainers, or trainers of trainers, effectively. So those master trainers can continue to support the other trainers in country to make sure that they maintain standards, but they're then also able to train new additional trainers as demand increases in the country. So Transaid's been working in a number of countries for this. Next slide, please. In 2008, Transaid partnered with the Industrial Training Centre in Zambia, building capacity for them to deliver training for truck drivers, for bus drivers, and for forklift operators. In 2010, Transaid's efforts expanded to Tanzania, where we work with the National Institute of Transport, a small university that has grown significantly since 2010, and we've been focusing on their driver training efforts. Again, truck drivers, bus drivers, and forklift operators. These two programs were supported or funded through efforts from Transaid's corporate member companies, so UK transport and logistics companies that support Transaid's efforts, and donated the services of their trainers to come out to these African countries to train driver trainers, to build their capacity and familiarity with different vehicles. Donations of vehicles have also been included. And this support continues to this day. In fact, this month, I believe there's 2 trucks that's heading out to Zambia to build the training fleet there. And in Tanzania, we've got a senior driver trainer from a UK company that's out on his holidays, but has donated time as well to Transaid to build capacity at the National Institute of Transport. So he's there for a couple of weeks. Going on, in 2015, Transaid developed the East African community's standardised curriculum for drivers of large commercial vehicles, freight and passenger, a bit of a mouthful. This was funded by Trademark East Africa, and its aim is to be used in all countries in East Africa. At the time, there was 5 member countries, but since, which are, I suppose, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. In the past year or so, we've had the additions of South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo joining. This curriculum has then been updated for this project that we're talking about today, for example, to make it more gender neutral. 2016 was when the original project started in Uganda, funded, as I've said, by GIZ's E4D programme. So the Professional Driver Training Uganda project was born in 2016. We built the capacity of a new driving school, Safely Rightway's Driver Training Centre in Mukono, about 25-30 kilometres outside of the capital, Kampala. In addition to building that capacity in that driving school, we've also been training quite a number of driving instructors from many other driving schools, based in Kampala, based in Jinja, and based in Fort Portal. In total, 17 trainers have been trained so far under this project, 3 of whom are female trainers belonging to a number of driving schools one in Mukono and Jinja. This project continues today in its second phase, and you'll hear more about that from Susan shortly. In 2021, Transaid's Professional Driver Training Programme expanded into Ghana through funding from Puma Energy Foundation, and also into Mozambique, once again funded by GIZ's E4D, Employment and Skills for Development in Africa. So this has sort of been the roadmap that Transaid has followed for professional driver training. And today we're going to focus on Uganda for our professional driver training project there. Next slide, please. I would now like to hand over to Susan Tumuhaire from Safely Rightway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us. My name is Susan Tumuhaire, as earlier introduced by Neil, and I work with Safely Rightway as the programs coordinator, but I'm also the lead on the driver training program that we're going to be talking about just now. Allow me to use my bragging rights right now to talk about these 2 pictures that you're seeing right here. So the picture on the left is a picture of Neil talking to Her Royal Highness Princess Anne, who visited us at Safely Rightway in 2022 towards the end of the year. So we're very honored and privileged to host her at the school, at the driver training school in Mukono. And it has done a lot for us. It has been good for our publicity and our visibility, and we are proud to have been her hosts in Uganda. And of course, the picture on the right is the lady that is climbing down from a vehicle, and that is one of our trained truck drivers, female truck drivers, that we shall be talking a lot more about as we go along. Next slide, please. So as Neil earlier mentioned, this is the second phase of the Professional Driver Training Project, PDT-U. So the first phase was very successful. So the reason why we started the second phase, or why we got funding for the second phase, was really to develop a sustainability plan for the successes that we already got from the first project. Because we had really registered a lot of success, and we wanted to make sure that these successes we can really sustain them. So the project came in at the right time, really to cement all those things that we had got in the first phase. Then another objective for the second phase was on advocacy. So we were looking to develop advocacy for two things mainly, and one of them was to ensure that the ESC curriculum that Neil talked about earlier was adopted by the Petroleum Authority of Uganda as the training guide for drivers in the oil and gas industry. As you know, in Uganda we have oil and gas developments at the moment. So the drivers that drive for that industry need to be really specialized and well trained. So we wanted to ensure that this curriculum is adopted to be used for the drivers on this particular project. And then secondly, advocacy was also looking at female participation. As you will know, and not just in Uganda, but world over, there is really less female drivers, particularly for trucks or heavy goods vehicles. So the advocacy was looking at ensuring that we get more female drivers, participating in the driving industry, and also partaking of the opportunities that are in the oil and gas industry. And related to also the sustainability, the project, the second phase was looking at the marketing and business strategy. So we wanted to implement the marketing and business strategy to ensure that we can be able to get the funds, we can be able to maintain and sustain the activities that we are doing, that were already started within the first phase of the project. And then, of course, I already talked about the driver training. But as part of the second phase of the project was to ensure that the drivers that we train, we also do as much as possible to support them into employment. So what we do is that, of course, we skill our drivers really, really well. So the employers who hopefully be on the call today or on the webinar today will ascertain to the fact that drivers are well trained. But of course, this is not enough. If you want to get the drivers into employment, you've got to do a bit more than that. So we also, apart from the skilling them to the best that they can be, we also train them on how to identify employment opportunities, both online and in other avenues. But we also look at how they apply for these jobs. How do they write their application letters? How do they write their CVs when they get invited for these interviews? How do they actually attend these interviews? And then once they get these jobs, how do they retain these jobs? So all of this is part of the second phase of this project. Next slide, please. So we are now going to talk about why do we have few women in the driving industry, and particularly for heavy goods driver industry. Over time, or in history, there's always been the heavy goods driving industry has always been dominated by men, and this is not just in Uganda but world over. And of course, because of this, women have always been put off. They've always left that job to be for men. So even when there is a job opportunity that is being advertised, women don't participate because they think that is only for men. If there is training available, women don't participate because they think that training is for men, because they're the ones who are going to get the jobs anyway. So of course, that has always been like a vicious cycle. And then you don't get more women getting involved because they think it's a male-dominated job. And then secondly is the poor or inadequate facilities for women at some of these workplaces. And this, of course, comes from the fact that historically, these places have been dominated by men. So some employers have not made an effort to put into place facilities for women. So even the women that have pushed and gotten these jobs have been put off quite quickly because either the facilities are for sharing with men or they don't exist at all. Well, they will exist, but they will be only for men. And women would not want to share with men these kinds of facilities. So some of them have actually have to leave the jobs because they don't feel like there's a place for them there. Then there is an issue of the work-life balance. I'll speak particularly for our culture here in Uganda. Women are generally the caretakers in the home. So they will look after their husbands, they look after their children. So for a job that requires a woman to be away from home for days is not really very welcome, because then the husband will consider having been deserted of sorts, and the children as well. So, and of course, we know that truck drivers, especially those who do long distance driving, for example, cross-border driving, they will be required to actually go away from their homes for a few days. And this is not very welcome in a home, and particularly for a woman. So women have not been able to take up some of these opportunities because of the requirements of the roles that these jobs have. And then there is an issue of harassment and criticism. And this is not just for female truck drivers, this is generally for women. The Ugandans on the call who are male, even the females will ascertain to this, that there is a bit of harassment on the roads for women. You know, if a woman is driving a bit slower, they will say, oh, it's because it's a woman. But of course, there's always a reason why she's driving a bit slower, because the women are a bit more keen on risk, and they don't take as many risks as the men do. But that, of course, is carried into the workplace, and some of the women have felt being harassed by their counterparts because they feel that they're pushing into a space that they don't belong. And then another issue that has been affecting women for the longest time is the lack of experience. So as you can imagine, for businesses that are into ferrying of you know, some of these products, first of all, the products are expensive, and secondly, they are going long distances, and some of the routes are very difficult. So an employer will find it a bit difficult to actually give a job to a woman who does not have experience in doing this job, you know, traversing these routes, some of which are very difficult, and giving them these very pricey goods to move to the next destination. So of course they're a bit hesitant to let the women take on these jobs who don't have experience, and that of course has also been sort of like a vicious cycle. If you don't give me an opportunity, then I'll never get experience. So I'll always be in the same position that I was a few years ago. And then another issue has been a bias of employers, because still the industry has been dominated by men on the most part. So there has never been, for some of the companies, there's never been a request for maternity leave for drivers. So all of a sudden you have women on the team that will need maternity leave naturally, because if they get pregnant, they're going to go away for some time. So then some of the employers who consider this as, you know, time lost or revenue lost during that time, they will not take on the women because they don't want to lose that time or the revenue, because they want to continue with their staff and not you know, have to give maternity leave. Next slide, please. Okay, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, or there is light in the tunnel. We have a partnership with some companies that have stepped forward and are very keen on employing women and bringing women on board. And I'm very proud to say that Hima Cement and Victoria Motors, who work closely together on this program, have a program called Women on Wheels. And what this program does is that it's attracting as many women as possible into the driving industry. And their aim is that they have 50% of their drivers as women. And as you can see, the women there looking back at us are all trained by Civil Right Way. And they have recently been employed by Hima Cement through Victoria Motors, who usually does their recruitment. And their aim for this program, the Women on Wheels, is to break the barrier, to change the narrative from only men can drive trucks, because we all know and believe right now at the moment that women can drive as well as the men. So we had a workshop with Hima Cement and Victoria Motors just to check on how the women that they have employed are doing, the women that have trained are doing, and this is some of the feedback that we got. They mentioned that since the increase of the drivers, since the increase of the women drivers, they have seen 7% increase in safe kilometers driven. And as we talked earlier, I think women are less, they are less risk takers, as we probably already know in our own experiences. And then they also mentioned a 6% more mileage per liter. So they've also been able to save fuel since the women have come on board. And then they've also registered a 12% improvement on fleet turnaround time. There is a joke that has been going around in Uganda for the longest time, where they say that truck drivers, of course, at that time there were no female truck drivers in Uganda. When I first heard the joke, the truck drivers have children at every stage, and every stage they mean every town. And from the talk with Hima, as part of the joke, still was saying, well, women cannot have women in every town, so there will not be a temptation for the women to stop in every town to check on their children, but men can, because they can have children in every town. So that could be a contributor to the 12% improvement on fleet turnaround time. But of course, I'm sure that there are other reasons for that Hima Cement could probably give us. And then they also registered a 15% improved driver behavior. I was thinking about this, and I thought, when you go to single-sex schools, boys can be notorious sometimes, but as soon as there's an opportunity for them to, to be mixed with the ladies, their behavior really, really improves extensively. So I thought this could also be a contributor, that once the women came on board, and then the boys had to check themselves and put themselves into better shape. So this could be a contributor to the improved driver behavior. And Hima Cement also noted improved customer relations. And I think this is also partly due to, the ladies are more welcoming, and they're more, they're warmer. It's not just a job, but it's an opportunity to connect several women. So I think that is what they experience at the moment. I think you can see the smiles of the ladies on that picture. You'd really want to do business with them, surely. And then they also noted a 15% lower vehicle maintenance cost. I mentioned about this. I think women are more, well, I could be biased because I'm a woman as well, but I think women are more keen on, we don't take as many risks. So if you're driving and you think there is something that is wrong, you're tempted, or you're forced to stop and find out what it is. But sometimes the men will want to push a bit more and say, this happens and it will be fine, it will be fine. So this is just me, probably from my biased point of view, but I think there is a keen interest in checking things as soon as there is a problem for women, and men would want to push a bit more, I think. Let's have a next slide, please. So on sharing with Hima Cement and Victoria Motors, we were checking with them how they've managed to attract and retain female drivers in the profession, and this is what they shared with us, is that they ensure that men and women get equal pay and equal benefits at the workplace, and of course that means that the women feel as valued as the men are. Irrespective of the position. So if whatever level they are on, they will be paid the same way. And then they also encourage the work-life balance. So they will try, Hima Cement and Victoria Motors will try and ensure that the women are employed closer to their home. So if there is a facility, a Hima Cement facility that is closer to their home, is where they will place the ladies, so that then they drive within their home region. And that, of course, that means that they can actually go home every evening and don't have to stay away for the night. But then they also ensure that the women have shorter routes, that they don't do a lot of cross-border routes. Also still to ensure that women can still come home and at the end of the day and be with their families. Yeah, and then there is the reward and recognition. This is not just for the ladies, this is for all their employees. They always reward and recognize good performance, and this naturally encourages people to stay in their jobs and to appreciate their jobs more. Then there is conducive rest facilities at their places of work. So unlike issues where we've had ladies coming back and saying, well, I had to leave the job because there were no facilities for women, these two employers ensure that there are good facilities for the women, and the women can feel like they indeed belong. They are not just an addition, but they actually belong in the system. And then female drivers, I encourage to speak up, because we talked about harassment. There is a possibility of harassment. There's a possibility of negative criticism at the workplace from anybody. It could even be the female counterparts. But they ensure that women have the avenues where they can, put their grievances, and the grievances are attended to as soon as possible. And then there is balanced convoy for difficult routes. So for certain routes that could be difficult, they always ensure that it's not just one driver who is traversing that route at the time, but then they put several drivers to move at the same time if the female driver is among them. So that in case there is a problem along the way, then that problem can be attended to by, the lady will know that she has company on the route and will not feel as isolated when something happens. And then maybe just something that I forgot to mention is that something that they do really, really well is that because at the beginning of this project, the Women on Wheels, the WOW project, there was this issue of experience where women were not employed because they didn't have experience. So what Hima Cement and Victoria Motors do is that they attach an experienced driver, an experienced female driver, to one of our trainees, and they drive with them for about a month, and this is all for them to gain experience. And if the month is not enough after assessment, then they can give them more time. They've made it intentional to ensure that they have the women on board, and really we are really grateful for this kind of work. And then there is fair treatment for all employees, female or male. And then there's the quick emergency response for all, and this of course applies to all their employees. They ensure that if you have a breakdown on the road, then you get support as quickly as possible. I know some drivers that have left their jobs because they call their line manager and say, I've got a tire burst, I can't move, and then they stay for a full day without any support. And of course, this is demotivating. But and of course, this would be even worse for a female driver because it increases their risks on the road if you don't attend to their issues as quickly as possible. Just imagine if it happened in the evening and then they have to stay there with the vehicle, and then it gets dark. So the fact that there is quick emergency response for all their staff makes it even easier for the women to actually appreciate these jobs and stay in the jobs. Next slide, please. Okay, well, I started with our bragging rights. I think I'll also end with our bragging rights. I will have our bragging rights again. We, according to our targets for the phase 2 of the project, we were looking at training at least 25 ladies. And we, in the end, have trained 53 ladies on heavy goods vehicles. And we are very proud that we've exceeded our targets, and all these ladies have been extremely happy with the training that they've had from the stories that I'm going to share just shortly. Next slide, please. So I'll just share two stories of some of the ladies that we have trained. This one is Justine. She was trained, she's trained with us. She owned a truck before she came to Safe Brightway, and she was ferrying sand to different building sites. And the time that she joined us, she was driving already, but then she did not feel confident. And then, of course, she said that her biggest problem was reversing. So she tried to avoid reversing as much as possible. But as a truck driver, if you don't reverse, then you really can't, you're not driving at all. So when she came to Safe Brightway, she got the skills, and she's returned back to her work, doing the ferrying of sand to different building sites, but also doing other businesses, her other businesses. And she says that the way the men that look at her and the ones that was seeing her before she came for the training are totally amazed that they change. Next slide, please. And then this is Rachel. Rachel is, she's a bus driver at the moment. She's, I think, the only bus driver of the Tondeka buses in the Kampala city. And she trained with us in the first phase, and then also came back in the second phase. We are proud to say that she won the award for the Professional Driver of the Year in 2022, and we're really proudly associated. She's a tough, amazing lady. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll just end with talking about the efforts that we put in to attract more women into the driving industry. So we have a subsidized cost of training. So the women do not pay for the training. The training is all paid for by the E4D program. So that means that the women can actually come in and not worry about having to pay, because it's already 100% subsidized. Then we also have workshops and experience sharing meetings. So at these workshops, we usually have the ladies that are interested in driving but have not yet started, the ladies that have trained but haven't got into employment yet. We have the ladies that have trained and are already in employment, and then we also have employers that have taken on women, and employers that are looking to take on women as their employees. And this is an experience sharing meeting, because it is an opportunity for the women that are already trained and employment can dispel myths that have for the longest time existed around truck driving. And you know, they say, we are here, we are doing this job, and it's fine, and it's doing great. So all those things that probably you've been seeing, we've been hearing, are just myths. You know, if we are doing it, you can do it too. So these have been really, really good in getting more women into the driver trainings that we have held. And then we are continuously engaging driving companies to bring on more women. So of course we have several. I kept talking about Hima Cement and Victoria Motors, but we have several companies that have taken on women. It's only that the others have a specific program that they're dedicated towards this. But then we continuously engage companies to have women on board as their drivers. And then finally, we support companies through the gender and awareness sensitization training, which I will not talk about because it's going to be spoken about by my colleague, Jason. So I'm going to hand over now to Jason Finch to take us through the next part of the presentation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Susan, and good morning, good afternoon. I'm Jason Finch, Project Manager at Transaid. Today I'm going to be filling in for Rachel Akuja, who is a social inclusion and gender expert based in Uganda. Unfortunately, owing to other work commitments, Rachel couldn't join us today, and so I'm going to do my very best to present some of Rachel's work on her behalf. Rachel came into the project mid last year as part of our efforts to support women into employment in the transport sector. Rachel's original assignment was to create and facilitate a bespoke gender awareness and sensitization training specifically then for the driver training community. And this was part of our efforts to ensure that, along with the adaptation of the EAC curriculum, which Neil mentioned at the beginning, that drivers, both female and male, begin their careers in an environment that promoted inclusivity and mutual respect, regardless of gender. I think Susan did a really good job of setting the scene, introducing us to some of those challenges and barriers that we're looking to address. And I wanted to use my time today to talk a little bit about the approach that we took to developing this new training manual. Given Rachel's past experience designing and facilitating trainings and other interactions in a variety of contexts, it was Rachel who encouraged us to consider a wider picture. The training space is just one environment that a driver goes through when they're joining the transport workforce. It could very well be the first environment, but then what happens beyond this training space, and what do these other environments look like, and who are the people in those environments, and could they too be included and benefit from this training? Next slide, please. So to enable this process, we began with a mapping exercise which aimed to plot a near linear progression of the route a driver would take through training, recruitment, and then into employment. So we started with the training space, the training provider, and we've plotted on the screen here 5 pretty typical stages that a learner driver will go through, from accessing the training onto their final assessment. And at each stage, the environment changes a little bit, visibly, excuse me, but also the people associated with those environments change too. And what we were trying to do here was break down that progression and make space to capture instances where gender bias or discrimination was either felt or witnessed. So these could be first-hand lived experiences or anecdotal accounts. There's only a couple of examples here on the screen, but we collected quite a long list. And I should take this opportunity just to clarify that these examples come from a variety of sources and are not representative of the practices at Safeway Right Way. Next slide, please. And then we continued this exercise through into the real world. And again, speaking to the drivers, we mapped it out in the same way. So you can see here on the left, often the first requirement of employment is experience. Susan mentioned that. Which is particularly challenging for new license holders. And then onwards, as we move left to right through the recruitment, the application and the interview, and then into the workplace, the hub or the plant. And then finally, at the far end on the right here, we've got the profession itself, the driving. Again, we collected quite a long list of examples, but for brevity's sake, I've just included a few on the screen here. But looking at these two data sets together, this was our wider picture, we realized. And what we noticed looking at the set was that firstly, that some of the environments are quite stable. They have physical infrastructure, they're repetitive. And we could think here of training schools and operational bases, for example. And then conversely, some of them are really much more dynamic. They're subject to change, particularly driving itself. In driving, the destination changes, the conditions change, the scheduling changes. And it's this change, and this change is also true of the people within those spaces. So some interactions are fleeting. They begin and end instantaneously. Susan, I think, mentioned a crude remark or gesture from somebody at the roadside, for instance, or other drivers. And then some interactions last quite a long time, colleagues and line managers, for example. The more stable those environments are and the more present the people associated with them are, the more control you have over those scenarios and those stages. And in here, you have the best opportunity, we realized, of affecting change. And beyond that control, you have a slightly weaker sphere of influence where you can maybe promote, lobby, advocate change. And then finally, beyond influence, you're really talking about preparation, being prepared. And this is particularly true in terms of safety, security, and risk mitigation. Next slide, please. So thinking about who our training audience should be, we wanted to include those with those larger spheres of control and influence. And we agreed that the training should target stakeholders from 3 main sectors. So the driver training providers, private sector employers, and the civil societies, or the transport associations that drivers are encouraged to interact with. This multi-sector approach is really important because none of them exist in the silo. They overlap and drivers might move backwards and forwards between these groups, or as often the case, they interact with more than one simultaneously. And as we prepared to reach out to these organizations, we began to think about who within each group would benefit from this training the most. And we agreed that any participant should ideally have a wide and diverse interaction with their colleagues, both female and male, but also have some vertical movement within their organization. So that's people who are able to inform upper management, but then also disseminate learning down and around them. Next slide, please. Excuse me. And at the time we were identifying the potential training participants, the development of the training content was already well underway. And this is very much Rachel's area of expertise. So for the most part, I kept my nose out of it. But every time I did see a working draft, it was like a living document. It had so much energy in it. And as we approached the start of the training, I think we were all getting really excited. Rachel, however, did let the wider team in on some of the training inclusions, mainly so we could talk about it, we could market it, particularly as preparations for hosting the training got underway. Excuse me. So briefly, the training would introduce and discuss gender concepts. And we would engage with these concepts with new language and new vocabulary. We'd also learn to identify problems and approach and receive them positively and collaboratively. And as part of the learning, we'd seek to empower participants with tools so that they can implement small, positive, measurable changes that keep growing. And finally, we wanted to encourage that participants not only embrace a more gender inclusive culture, but also have that culture as part of their brand and their public facing image. Next slide. Unfortunately, I don't have time to cover the content of the training in too much detail, but I will shortly summarize our plans to share and make that training more available at a later date. But for now, let me just run through the modules as we have them. So the training is roughly divided into a morning and afternoon session. The morning is focused on the theory behind gender inclusivity. And this starts with setting the scene and importantly, creating a safe space and then sharing expectations. Creating the safe space is from the outset really important because some of the topics and some of the language that is used in the training is quite sensitive. And we want to encourage participation, but also at the same time, make sure that it's equally respected, an individual's choice that they might not want to actively participate, but they still wanted to be present all the time. With the scene set, including the first of many warm-up exercises, we begin to introduce and discuss gender concepts and terminologies, and recognizing that participants are coming in with perhaps a varying level of knowledge. It's almost like we start over. A topic of particular focus in this module is the difference between sex and gender, and then learning how most bias and prejudice is rooted in the social construct of gender, but then applied to sex. The morning session wraps up with a module on gender inclusivity and mainstreaming, and the group applying those newly learned concepts to the transport sector. We propose everyday scenarios, and then our new aspiring inclusivity practitioners re-examine them through the gender lens. And this is probably my favorite module in the training because these scenarios are delivered by one group to the other through role play, which is incredibly entertaining. Next slide, please. In the excuse me. In the afternoon session, the participants are encouraged to look a little bit more inwards on themselves and in their own organizations. Again, referring back to those spheres that I was speaking about earlier, about control and influence. So narratives are how we talk, how we act, and how we think of ourselves and the others around us. It's also how we feel belonging, and it's how we accept. It's how we feel belonging, and it's how we accept others. And transport, like any other profession, is full of these narratives. So this module in the afternoon session focuses on identifying the strategies to implement change from the perspective of both the self, the individual, and then the organization or the wider collective. And so we think, what does change look like, and how can we enact change as either an individual or an organization? To facilitate these strategies, we've introduced simple tools to evaluate the self and the organization that each participant belongs to. There's a checklist to complete first, which asks quite probing questions, and that aims to bring to light areas that might need focus. Areas, again, which hail back to that mapping exercise and those different stages that we discussed. The answers are a simple yes, no, or don't know. And this is the first step to identifying either a strength to be continued or a weakness that might need improving. And then we move into the action planning. The action plan is a template where we lift those areas of weakness into a framework which identify changes that each participant wishes to bring about, either on themselves or the organization. And also it plots out who should be involved, how it could be measured, and when ideally it could be completed by. The framework also came from the mapping exercise at the beginning. And again, breaking down those larger spaces and environments into smaller, manageable and measurable actions. And this is in recognition that the transformative change we're aiming for, it isn't sudden, and nor does it happen instantaneously or overnight, but it really begins with identifying and addressing small, sometimes discrete issues and taking incremental steps towards a larger and more long-term visible change. Next slide. Brilliant, my last slide, and thank you very much for staying with us. I'm pleased to say that the pilot exercise and the first application of the training was a success. We exceeded our project target by bringing 22 participants from 7 organizations through this first training. The feedback we received was overwhelmingly positive, with many noting that it was something new, it was refreshing, and it felt like an extra skill set that they could take back to their places of work. Looking ahead, we're always committed to improving our training offerings, and we're listening to the feedback that we've received. We intend to strengthen the take-home toolkit and then actively look for new opportunities to include this training in our other current and future PDT professional driver training programs. This training in particular was really designed for the Ugandan context, and so it draws on Uganda's cultural and societal references throughout. And what's really exciting about the opportunity to scale the reach of this training and move it into another geography is the opportunity again to consult with the local expert to ensure that the training is just as relevant and impactful. In line with our belief that best practice should be shared, we also plan to release the Ugandan training manual on our website's Knowledge Center at some point in the future, where it can be freely downloaded and used. And before I hand back to Neil for the question and answer session, I just want to say a huge thank you to Rachel in particular. Sorry you can't be here today. It was a real pleasure to have worked with you on this project, I think, for the whole team. And then also all of those joining us today from Uganda who contributed to the development of this training. It was a real group effort. It was really interesting. And to all of you, all of those who stayed with us and went on to participate in the training, it's greatly appreciated. And thank you all very much, and back to you, Neil.
Thank you, Jason, for that. Thank you, Susan, as well. So that's the end of our presentations for this webinar. So now there's opportunities for questions and hopefully answers. So if you've not already sent in questions and you've got anything on your mind about what we've discussed so far today, please do send them in via the question link on the webinar screen. And as I said, it'll vary from system to system as to how you do that. If you're not finding that question link with the question mark or the word question and that, if that's not coming up on your screen, the other opportunity is to put your question into chat. So we've got a number of questions just now, so I'll start with them, and if more come in, we'll add them to the list of questions we've got. So first question is aimed at Susan. So of the companies that hire women, are there any or many women in management positions? Are you aware of that?
At the moment, thank you very much for the question. At the moment, first of all, the women have just only started into these jobs, and of course, as you can imagine, they applied, they went in as drivers at the time. So they aren't any women now that are in managerial positions yet. So right now they are drivers, but at the rate, I'm very positive at the rate that from all these positive reviews that we are getting, we have very strong faith that that time will come. But first of all, we need them to first make it we need them to be long enough in the driving positions to encourage other women that you can actually be a driver and be a good driver and have it as your profession and not just look at being a manager in a job. So right now where they are as drivers and doing a good job, we're happy for it.
Thank you, Susan. So yeah, so for women in management positions who started as drivers, it's not happened yet. Obviously, we do have women in management roles within transport companies and that who have entered the industry directly into management. They've not been a driver, they don't have that experience. So we are really hopeful for the women that we've trained as they move up towards management. They will have a much better insight into the lives of a truck driver, the challenges that they face and all that as well. Next question to Jason, I think. The approach to women in the transport sector is at what you might call the end of the journey, i.e. women are in the industry. Are there any programs or efforts to address this issue earlier, such as women drivers speaking at schools, university courses in the transport and logistics, being marketed towards women as well?
It's a good question, Neil. So it's still considered, in an African context, the context that we're familiar with, where we work, it's still considered a male profession. It's still considered an informal job as well. And so the opportunities to perhaps enter into that section aren't as robust as what we might see in the UK or elsewhere, where there's apprenticeship schemes and there's support offered to going into professional training. I would probably say that there are some participations in the universities now in transport and logistics and transport related trainings, which are beginning to attract more women. They do still remain male dominated, but there are, of course, advocacy groups. Particularly, I'm thinking of some of the transport associations. Women in Logistics and Transport comes to mind, have many chapters across Africa, and they are really good resources for through membership to access some training and some professional development, which might encourage women to stay with that profession and take it on as a career. So I think seeking out those, working with those groups in particular, would be a good first step. And that's certainly an approach that we've taken, Transaid has taken in Ghana with our professional driver training program there. They really are the conduit which opens up the access to a whole new market, really. So certainly the associations and the civil societies, yeah.
Thank you, Jason. Another question which we will aim at, what shall we say? Which one next? Susan, the figures, the statistics you provided about the benefits of gender inclusivity in the drivers, how did you calculate the increased figures? That might be as easy for me to answer for you, if you're happy for that. The figures were provided by HEMA Cement through their own data tracking, whether that's telematics and all their records around their drivers and vehicles. So these statistics were developed, provided by HEMA, so we can't really explain much further than that. Another question. This one I'll let Susan answer. Would Safely Rightly look to bring on female trainers? And if so, do you think this would be beneficial?
Yes, Safely Rightly is actually looking into having some female trainers, that's for sure, and we have done for quite some time. But at the moment, according to the Ministry of Works and Transport, for someone to actually qualify as a trainer or to actually train as a trainer, they've got to have had a number of years in the driving industry and actively in the driving industry. So we are definitely looking into it, because we have trained some women as trainers, although it has mostly been on the theory part. but we want to bring on some trainers as for both theory and practical. So that is something that we really have our eyes on in the next coming, maybe by the end of this year or in the next coming few months, that we proactively get into having a female trainer, at least one female trainer on board in the next coming months. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Yes, I would add that is a big challenge for getting female trainers. One is finding a female that's got enough experience driving trucks, but we've now got, what, 60% of our 53 drivers out there driving trucks, so they're gaining experience. And I know a number of them have expressed an interest in becoming trainers. But as Susan said, there is the challenge. The regulations currently say to be a trainer, you have to have held your license for that class of vehicle for 5 years before you can become a trainer. So that is a major barrier. At the moment, these 53 women, any of those who want to become a trainer at the moment would have to wait 5 years before they've held their license long enough. If that regulation hasn't changed with changing regulations that's happening at the moment, then we need to look for a waiver through the minister himself that we could identify, the best performing female drivers with aspirations to become trainers and get a waiver to that requirement of the 5 years of holding the license. It doesn't say 5 years experience. The regulation says you've just held the license for 5 years, whether you've driven or not. But if we can sort of demonstrate that these women have experience and skills, they could be fantastic trainers to add to Safely Right Way. What does it mean to make the gender materials or curriculum gender inclusive? Jason, would you like to answer that one?
To make the training curriculum gender inclusive?
Yes.
Okay, so yes, Neil, this is I think we both mentioned this during the presentation. So this is the EAC standardized curriculum for heavy goods vehicles, freight and passenger. Did I get that right?
Almost.
Okay, so the standard itself is comprised of two documents. There's the curriculum, and then there's a training manual, and they complement each other. As part of this program, this iteration of professional driver training program in Uganda, we wanted to make sure, as part of the bringing in supporting more women into employment, that those founding, those base foundation materials were inclusive, gender inclusive. They are technical documents, so they do lend themselves quite well to gender neutrality already. But just to make sure, we had a team of industry and gender experts review those materials and make sure that they didn't lean into any tone or language or any content that could be excluding of either males or females. And I think that as part of that process, we've now updated that curriculum and the standards in circulation. And I think it's as part of that adaptation, it's really about then going back into the training spaces and making sure that those materials are being interpreted to the benefit of all drivers, both female and male. And I'll just give you an example that Susan actually mentioned to me on my last trip to Uganda. Simple things like preparing trainers for learning. So trainers coming in to learning for the first day. Let's set the scene, because there are certain types of clothing that are quite restrictive if you're learning to drive a vehicle. And maybe on the first day of training, if everybody doesn't turn up wearing long trousers and flat shoes, it could cause delay and it could cause some embarrassment. So it's things like that. It's taking the adapted materials and just making sure that those trainers who are implementing those materials are communicating that standard in its fullest to the training participants in good time.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, so it's often the implementation of the training that needs to be adjusted, and that's what Rachel, through her gender sensitivity training, has included. I would say in the manual itself, some relatively minor changes had to be made to make it more gender neutral. And these were as simple as finding where the manual says he or his and change it to they or their, or simply the driver to be that. So it's these simple things is to try and convert all of that to be neutral. The rest of the wording was found to be neutral anyway. It was just these examples of where we were referring to the driver in the male gender. Next, let's throw another one at Jason, why not? What can be done to improve the safety and security issues women face while driving?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. If we go back to a little bit of how I was explaining through our stakeholder mapping and engagement, the exercise that we did, we were considering, where, how far our area of control went, and then beyond that we have influence, and then beyond influence you have sort of preparation. So safety and security does really relate to all three of those spheres, but there's probably a greater emphasis on preparation because as a driver is going out, there's only so much you can do to mitigate the risks. The better the risk mitigation, of course, the better. Susan spoke about, some of the concerns that both employers and drivers have expressed about the various stages that they reach, stopovers, late night stopovers, inadequate facilities, provision of areas to eat and sleep comfortably, and they're very real challenges, not just in Uganda but also in the UK and elsewhere. What we found is to work with the private sector to identify best practice, and so in some sectors, I would say we found that in the bus, the intercity bus passenger transporters, for example, they have some quite interesting models that we could learn from, because each stage or each stop on that route is slightly more enhanced with better facilities. Because there's a customer base, the bus comes off, a large bus might have 65 passengers on it, so they all need to have good facilities and places potentially to rest, and also to access to food and clean water and stuff. So that industry in particular it could be quite attractive for women wanting to enter into the workforce. And then at the other some of the other hauliers, perhaps the more advanced ones, the larger fleets, those carrying maybe dangerous or hazardous goods, where there is already a heightened level of security. We see CCTV implemented in the cabs. They're also more likely the vehicles to be tracked, monitored, and there'll be geofencing on those cargoes as well. And these are all things that we need to identify and promote, and create those case studies, and then bring them back into the wider community, and sort of recommend that these are implemented more widely. So I think, to sort of round up, Neil, the best practice does exist in the industry, and it's about showcasing them and providing a platform, I think, for those to be shared more widely.
Thanks, Jason. Right, I think we have 2 more questions to go. I suppose I better try answering one of them myself. So this one I'll ask to myself: how do women overcome the lack of driving experience that most employers ask for? So yeah, so this was a topic that Susan had raised, and about new female drivers being assigned an experienced female driver, and to work with them for a month or more, depending on needs, so they can build experience, not only driving the trucks and the different trucks to what they were trained on, but driving trucks with a cargo, and then the interactions with customers, the route planning, etc., company policies, and all that. So yes, there are challenges, and HEMA Cement have addressed that by being able to assign an experienced female driver to support a new female driver. Other companies may not have that option because they don't have senior female drivers. They've got no female drivers. They're now just looking to incorporate them into their company. So there's challenges there. They will need to very carefully select mentor drivers to be with this woman for whatever period of time as she gains experience. And obviously, the company needs to look at the safety and security of all their staff anyway, but for the likes of a new female driver having to share the cab overnight with a male mentor driver, or sharing facilities at rest stops, which may not have anything specifically for females. So there's a lot still to be addressed. And one of the things that Susan had explained was quite often being selective of the routes that females get allocated, so they're shorter and then have the opportunity to return to base at night, and then to return home to the family home. And the last question, well, I'll throw another one at Jason, why not? next steps that you mentioned, integrating the training into other PDT, professional driver training programs, are there any examples of that currently happening or planned?
Are there any examples of the training that we've developed being going into programs?
Yes, the gender inclusivity training from Rachel.
Oh, I would say planned always. We're always planning. We've got, we're quite fortunate in that we have long-standing good relationships with driver training providers in Zambia, Tanzania, Uganda, and in Ghana. And I think that what we're looking to do this year is to build that training as part of our professional driver training program more widely. So I think that certainly in Uganda, we've identified an appetite. We've got really strong feedback from our participants. We've had inquiries about the availability of the training. And what I'd like to do is consider maybe a two-pronged approach to this, in having Rachel also deliver this training again, because she's just an excellent facilitator, and then working to adapt that material so it can be picked up by anyone really and implemented in the workplace. It may be a bite-sized pieces. So certainly in Uganda, we have an ongoing project in Ghana as well, where we'd like to possibly run this training as well. And I think it just anywhere that we're delivering our training of trainers or training of master trainers, I think this is just an excellent complementing piece of work that really adds value. So yeah, so hopefully certainly Uganda and very possibly Ghana, and but we will keep looking for opportunities elsewhere as well.
Thank you, Jason. Well, that is all the questions that I think we've received so far. But please, if after this webinar you think of anything, we have a couple of contacts on the last slide that we're displaying at the moment, email addresses for myself and for Jason as well. So do please feel free to get in touch with anything. So I'd like to just thank my colleagues on the panel that were speaking today, Susan Tumuhaire, Jason Finch, and myself, Neil Ritty. And I'd like to thank you all for attending, giving us your attention, giving up your valuable time. I hope this webinar has been of interest to you. I hope it's maybe generated some ideas, some thoughts for you to take back to your own organisations. And thank you all very much. And as I said earlier, a link to the recordings for this webinar, along with a link for the slides, will be made available to everybody who registered for this call. So thank you, one and all. Good afternoon, good morning, good day, goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.